Live from Washington, D.C., this is Balance of Power with Joe Mathieu.
No deal yet to avoid a shutdown. Welcome to the Thursday edition as a package of spending bills, including Homeland Security, fails today in the U.S. Senate. This just happened thanks to Democratic demands for new restrictions on ICE, but there were Republican no votes as well. There may be a compromise in the works. We've got eyes on the White House, and we'll discuss with Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall, who has the latest for us, with insights ahead from Congressman Gregory Meeks of New York, the top Democrat on the House Foreign Affairs Committee. And as the president's border czar tries to lower the temperature in Minneapolis, we'll have details and analysis from our political panel. It's all after a look at Wall Street. Having some trouble today following some earnings reports, beginning with Microsoft. Thanks for being with us on the Thursday edition. They just wrapped the cabinet meeting at the White House. 1 hour and 20 minutes. Not the 2 hour plus or even the 3 hour plus romp that we've seen in meetings past. There were some differences, beginning with no questions. Press pool was brought in. We heard from a number of cabinet officials, with one big exception, but no questions were taken by the president or any of the other officials in the room. Tyler Kendall, Bloomberg Washington correspondent, joins us now ahead of our conversation with Congressman Gregory Meeks, who's going to be with us in just a moment here with a lot to talk about. A potential government shutdown on the menu for tomorrow and big questions about the future of Homeland Security funding. Tyler's with us in our Washington bureau. An hour and 20 minutes, no questions, also no Nome.
Yeah.
Kristi Noem was never called on.
Right. That seems to be pretty shocking, or maybe not shocking at all, considering she seems to be the cabinet member who has been most in the news recently after we saw this recent reshuffling on the ground in Minneapolis. We saw the border czar sent in, Tom Homan, replacing the chief of border patrol, Bovino. And even though that's not directly Kristi Noem, instead, what was sort of the underlying here is that Homan is going to report to Trump, not to the DHS secretary. So it appears to have been pulling her back after what happened in Minnesota. Still, the president has maintained that he has full confidence in her. He's been asked directly whether or not she's going to leave her post, even as we've heard what's been an increased outcry on Capitol Hill, including some Senate Republicans like Tom Tillis, Lisa Murkowski, saying that she ultimately should vacate that position. But as of now, he's standing firm. But perhaps that was by design. I think that probably would have been one of the questions if reporters had been afforded that opportunity. Yeah,
well, that's for sure. And I'm sure they would have asked about the potential for a shutdown tomorrow as well. The president did say, though, that nobody wants a shutdown and he's working with Democrats. That was about all we got there. As we look at the guidance today from the White House, there's one big event at the end of the day, Tyler, and that's the premiere of the Melania documentary. This is going to take place, I believe, at what we used to call the Kennedy Center. The president, first lady, but the guest list is remarkable. Beyond those who were in the cabinet room, Jordan Belfort, the Wolf of Wall Street, reportedly Eric Adams will be there. Gianna Infantino's got to be there. Dr. Phil. Who else do we expect?
I also saw the rapper Waka Flocka Flame is going to be there as well. We know that this is something that the president has been looking forward to. He's talking about it a lot. He himself is going to appear at the Kennedy Center as they try to promote this movie and perhaps Melania's position in the administration, as we haven't heard as much from her perhaps this year, but she has taken on some initiatives. Of course, we know her Be Best campaign when it comes to cyberbullying, and also her efforts when it comes to the Russian-Ukraine war and helping those Ukrainian children that were taken from her home. So it'll be interesting to see what her comments are focused on ahead of this release of this movie.
I guess the after parties are going to be quite the story tomorrow. With the latest on Waka Flocka Flame, that is Tyler Kendall, Bloomberg Washington correspondent, because, well, it's 2026. I'm Joe Mathieu in Washington, and thank you for being with us here on Balance of Power Thursday edition. As we count down to what will probably be a partial shutdown, but maybe not a very long one. There's a deal reportedly in the works between Chuck Schumer and Donald Trump that would help to avoid this from being longer than a couple of days. If DHS is stripped out of the 6-bill package, put in place a CR, and follow up next week when the House comes back with a new bill that would put restrictions on ICE, beginning with body cameras and new training. That's at least where we are now. That may not come to fruition, but the president seemed pretty optimistic about it, and reports would suggest the same. Gregory Meeks, the congressman from New York, joins us right now, the top Democrat on the House Foreign Affairs Committee, who is in the throes of this debate right now with a unique perspective as the top Democrat on foreign affairs. Congressman, welcome. It's great to have you back on Bloomberg TV and radio. Did I just describe a likely scenario? When you come back next week with your colleagues, will you have a new bill to vote on for DHS?
Well, I surely hope so. I think nobody really wants to shut down, but we cannot continue with the bill that was sent over to the Senate from the House. So I hope that the Senate Republicans and the president works with Senator Schumer so that we have a new bill. Well, number one, that the DHS funding is out of the other 6 bills, of which we had basically some bipartisan agreements, so that we can make sure that there are changes in the DH bill. What you said is right. We want to end roving patrols and have some enforce and accountability. We want to make sure that there's an increased transparency. We get rid of no judicial warrants, no mask. We can't wear masks. So I think that if that kind of dialogue and conversation is taking place, and I hope that Senator Thune works with Senator Schumer to pass a bill with those kinds of things in them, then we will be able to vote on a new bill when we get back on Monday.
I guess the question is, will it pass the House? Because you know well that there are some strong objections in the Freedom Caucus and in other quarters of the Republican conference. But Congressman Meeks, today we saw Ron Johnson, Tommy Tuberville, Mike Lee, Ted Budd, and Rand Paul all vote against the bill that was brought to the floor, this procedural vote. What does that tell you about a likely passage in the House?
Well, I think that it should pass. All we really need in the House is 3 to 4 Republicans to vote with us. And if they see that some of the Republican senators, will stand and do the right thing, that should give them the coverage to do the same thing also. Look, the situation as we see with reference to ICE is completely out of control. Accountability is not an option. It's a requirement. And Congress has that requirement of making sure that we are holding individuals accountable. And so I think that's what is at stake. That's not even a Democrat or a Republican issue. It is basically standing for doing the right thing when we see American citizens being gunned down in the streets by ICE agents.
We talked with Robin Kelly a couple of days ago, Congressman, who has drafted articles of impeachment for Kristi Noem that I believe you have co-sponsored, you have signed on to. Where does that effort stand? And is her removal one of your demands for a deal?
Well, absolutely. I mean, it's critical. You see an individual who is not ready, she's never been ready for the job that she has. When you make the kind of statements that she made immediately after both the shootings of Renee Good as well as Alex Preddy, without any evidence, other than what your actual eyes have seen that took place, it just shows that she needs to be gone. And so, Donald Trump used to talk about, in his reality TV days, et cetera, you're fired. So either he says you're fired or we should continue to move forward with a motion to impeach her because she clearly is not the right person for that job.
Well, you've been around Washington for a minute, Congressman. What did you make of the fact that the president didn't call on her just now? It was an hour and 20-minute long cabinet meeting, no questions. And of all the cabinet officials he asked to speak, she was not one of them. Does that tell us anything about her standing?
Well, I think that it does. It also tells us, though, that the president is not being transparent either. We need to have transparency from the president of the United States of America. Some of this that's taking place, doesn't have clean hands in this. When you look at how and what he has said about people in Minnesota, why he sent 3,000-4,000 troops there to call this surge, in the language that he uses in regards to many of the citizens there, how he's attacked its governor and its mayor, he is the one that set the stage for what took place. And to my mind's eye, is similar to how he set the stage to what took place on January the 6th. They're one and the same. So her standing should be, in jeopardy. But we've seen, unfortunately, this White House, those that have attacked law enforcement officers, in January 6th, he's pardoned them. And in this case, those who are killing innocent American citizens, and how, even if you look at how they are going after, for example, 5-year-old Lamb Ramos, that's not what the American people want. That's not what we stand for. We want to make sure if you going after criminals, those who've been convicted of felons, we want them gone. That's what the people wanted, and I want, to be quite frank. I think there's no partisanship therein. But to do what he has done, set the stage that he has, and then try to hide behind it is not what we need from a president of the United States. But we do need him to stand up. If he really means something, want to really show something, fire Kristi Noem. Fire her now.
Wow, Congressman. There are a couple things I want to get to you with our remaining time here as ranking member on House Foreign Affairs. What are you hearing? What do you want to see happen with Iran? The president, as he says, has put a massive flotilla, another massive armada he's characterized larger than what was put off the coast of Venezuela. Are we about to strike Iran again?
Look, if the president feels that there's an imminent threat to the people of the United States or there's a real need to have a military strike on Iran, he should come to Congress first, give us that information so that we can make authorization on the utilization of military force or a War Powers Act. So if, in fact, that's the case. And as well as, I think it is tremendously important to make sure that we're talking to all of our allies in the region, because they are ones that are in direct danger of any other kind of activity that Iran may do in retaliation. So I would also make sure that we're in close dialogue and conversation, and I would want to hear that with the Saudi Arabians, with Israel, with the Jordanians, that they all are affected by that, and making sure also that we're not undermining the people that we want to help, because very clearly we stand with those brave Iranians who are fighting for freedom within their own country. This did not happen because of the United States or the United States urging. This happened by an organic group of Iranians who are proud and strong and tired of their authoritarian type government that's been ripping off the people for a long period of time. And so what does this mean to them, and how that operates, all that has to be looked at and considered before there's a strike.
Well, that's a lot to consider. And if it takes place in the coming days, Congressman, we'd like to talk with you about it. Let's go local before you leave us. You've got a new mayor in New York City, and he's calling for higher taxes on the rich to address what he describes as a fiscal crisis for his city. Do you support that effort?
No, look, what I support is let's try to figure out how do we make things more affordable. There's got to be ways of which we're talking about this. I think that there's some areas of where individuals be ready to step up and do their fair share. So I'm not talking about broad taxes that would be placed on everyone or certain individuals. The governor of New York has clearly stated that she does not want to raise taxes. I understand that. We don't want to run people out of the city of New York. That's not what this is about. We would need some of the resources that the federal government had been sending to New York, that the president of the United States started to punish New York and not have delivered those resources. So there's a number of ways I think that we can cut into that deficit and not have to raise taxes.
Okay, well, so 2%, another 2% on people making more than $1 million a year is a non-starter?
Yeah, I think that right now I'm with the governor, who says that we're not going to raise taxes. We're not going to chase people out of the city of New York. We're going to figure out how we can work together to collectively make things more affordable. And the first way to do that is the president to stop these tariffs that he is continuing to implement around the world that's driving these prices up.
Yeah, I'm going to mention an important stop on the road today on Bloomberg TV and radio. We're going to be hearing from Mayor Mamdani in the late edition of Balance of Power, 5 p.m. Wall Street time. his sit-down conversation with Bloomberg's Miles Miller will loom large in our coverage this evening, and I hope that you will be here for us when that takes place later on. Fed independence is also on the menu in Washington right now. Congressman Meeks, the president just said in the cabinet meeting that he will announce his pick for a Fed chair next week. What are you anticipating?
Well, look, this president seems to be wants to be a king. He wants to be able to control the Fed and not have it as an independent board, to make its decisions based upon the economy and what it believes is the appropriate way to move. So I would hope, the president is free to choose whoever he wants to be on the board. But, the kinds of acts, I would hope that we don't have someone who just wants to rubber stamp whatever the president says and does for political purposes. One of the things that has been most important by the Fed is their independence, so that they can make a decision based upon the economic totality of which they have to deal with. And so that is what sustained us and why others would have invested in the United States, because of that kind of sustainability and independence. And I would hope that the president will continue, or the Fed will continue in that manner.
Mm-hmm. Well, I know that that's important to you as a member of the Financial Services Committee, and as long as Tom Tillis is stopping things down in the Senate, this could be a longer conversation, Congressman. It's great to see you, and thank you for joining us, as always, on Bloomberg. That's Gregory Meeks, Democrat from New York's 5th and ranking member on the House Foreign Affairs Committee. We'll assemble our panel next for their take on all of this as we count down to what likely will be another short and partial shutdown at the end of the day tomorrow. This is Bloomberg. Well, thanks for coming along today. Thursday edition, we have news. The bills failed, which should come as no surprise if you listen to this program. This was the combined 6-bill minibus, as we call it, including the Department of Homeland Security, right? Each agency gets its own bill. This is how we keep the government from closing. This 6-bill package, though, failed because of that one bill. And there's a deal in the works, supposedly, reportedly, and the president acknowledged it today, says he is working with Democrats. That's between Chuck Schumer and Donald Trump to craft another bill that would be voted on presumably next week when the House gets back, that would put restrictions on ICE enforcement, body cameras, training, and the rest. We've been talking about this now for days. So if they put a CR on DHS, let's get to the alphabet soup. We avoid a shutdown, actually. The other agencies will be made whole, and then next week the restrictions would follow. That's the perfect case scenario. And when we heard from John Thune, of course, the Republican leader, the majority leader in the U.S. Senate yesterday, he gave us his take on these possible negotiations. Listen.
A government shutdown is not in anybody's interest. If there are things that the Democrats want that the administration can agree, with them about, then let's do that.
This is not border security. This is not law and order. This is chaos. Senate Democrats are united on a set of common sense and necessary policy goals that we need to rein in ICE and end the violence.
Thune and Schumer, we already heard from Trump in an 1 hour and 20-minute long cabinet meeting. So let's assemble our panel for their take. Republican strategist Maura Gillespie is with us from Bluestack Strategies, and Democratic strategist Arshi Siddiqui is with us as well. With me here in studio, founder, CEO of Bellwether Government Affairs. It's great to see you both. Both of you, I should note, worked for former speakers. Arshi worked for Nancy Pelosi, and Maura worked for John Boehner. So we're going to get the view from the Speaker's office, which will be the center of the political universe next week. Maura, what does Mike Johnson need to prepare for, knowing that some members of his Republican conference, beginning in the Freedom Caucus, do not want to see a rewrite of DHS, and they're already in no?
Well, right now, he's also got to deal with a logistic challenge, right? I mean, members are not there in the House. He is, but members are not in D.C., and so he's going to have to sort out how many people he can get back by Monday. People are on Codell. I believe he mentioned to some reporters today that it is a numbers game and trying to get people back on the Hill to do this vote Monday. So that's part of the challenge. I think the other challenge is, how long the CR goes. there are conversations being had right now in the Senate between Republicans and Democrats who are disagreeing on the length of a CR for DHS funding because they are concerned about giving too much time to negotiate. And so I do think that will, to your point about Freedom Caucus members, that'll dictate sort of how they land on the issue. But by and large, I think Republicans recognize that taking the DHS funding out of this and making that a CR is the best case scenario and the best path forward right now.
Is that the best case scenario for you, Arshi, knowing that there'll be some time to negotiate in that world? What would be an appropriate duration? Obviously, nobody's coming back from the House this weekend. They're all encased in ice somewhere. In fact, Mike Johnson told Bloomberg Government, we typically have 72-hour notice. We're waiting for the Senate to take action to determine the course. So we're already into next week. Funding lapses, well, I guess in that one agency, or all, I guess it would be all six if the House didn't get a chance to follow up on that vote. Is a week enough? Is it weeks?
Well, I think two points. One is, I mean, there could be an exploration of a UC in the House.
Yep.
I mean, as you know, the Speaker has quite a bit of latitude on how he deals with the floor.
That would take a Christmas miracle, though, would it not?
I mean, I think at the end of
anything unanimous in the House right now.
Well, if all the members aren't back, that's one piece. And then other piece is, like, all roads lead back to Donald Trump, right? And this deal is fairly straightforward in terms of these protections, in terms of training, background checks, et cetera. So it is something that can be put together quickly. I do think time is of the essence, so a short-term CR makes sense, but too much time, I don't think helps move this process forward.
Are you encouraged by the Republicans who voted no today?
I think it was a good...
Mike Lee, Tommy Tuberville, it's not just Rand Paul is the point.
Absolutely. And this all goes back to civil liberties and an assault on constitutional protections, which is what we've seen on the ground in Minnesota and actually in other instances across the country.
Yeah. Maura, how should Mike Johnson read that? When you see the names of the R's who voted no, Ron Johnson, right? Not a moderate, Tommy Tuberville, Mike Lee, Ted Budd, and yes, Rand Paul. How does that help set your focus on what might come from the Republican conference next door?
Well, it reminds him that the crux of the issues are those constitutional issues. And I do think that you're also seeing a bit of the fraying of having given so much authority to the president and to the White House in terms of things that should normally be, decided by Congress and involving Congress in conversations that require votes from congressional input. And so you're seeing that frustration and really the drawing of a line in the sand here by some senators who feel as though this is going too far and they're going to clamor back some of what they believe their constituents are asking them to do. I did think it does give him some room to convince maybe some of his hardline members in the House to point to those members and say, here's what Senate, Tuberville did. Here's what Senator Lee did. Kind of look to them and try and convince them to go with him on this minibus journey that they're now going on. And I think that'll help him steer the ship back to where it needs to go. I do also think that President Trump not taking questions at the end of that cabinet meeting today signals to me that he is really serious about having these conversations and negotiations. And that's a positive because otherwise, he would be lamenting more or less to the press or trying to get, Senate Democrats to bend to his will. But here it shows that he is actually making the good faith effort to get a solution. And that's a positive, not only for Congress, but for the American people.
That's a really smart observation, Maura. We can look at this a couple different ways. He did not call on Kristi Noem, and I'm sure there were multiple reasons for that. But in an hour and 20 minutes to not go to questions means something. I mean, look, this could have been a 3-hour-long cabinet meeting like we had a couple of months ago with endless questioning. He clearly doesn't want to spoil what's in the works here, huh?
I mean, I think the stakes are really high, and we've seen 2 U.S. citizens. I mean, we saw that over and over. It's playing on cable TV constantly. Right. So I think that kind of goes back to the issues, and then we go back to the constitutional protections. I mean, I think those Senate votes do really indicate. I mean, we're talking about freedom of speech, the right to actually protest peaceably, right to bear arms. All of these issues are coming out in full force on the streets. And then we haven't even talked about the economic impacts in terms of across the country what these indiscriminate raids are doing to folks who are actually staying back at home, not working in hotels, restaurants, all of that. That's also a drag on the economy.
Well, I'll tell you what, this all brings us back to the state of Minnesota. We probably would not be having this conversation if it were not for the fatal shootings in Minneapolis. And we've got pretty big news on the governor's race there. First, it was a shocker when Tim Walz says he was not running for re-election. Now, as some saw coming in the last couple of days, Amy Klobuchar is going for it. The senator announcing she is running for governor of Minnesota, where, of course, this entire story has been swirling. And she's up with a video. That's the way you do it now to announce her candidacy. Watch and listen.
I am running for this job for every person who wants their work recognized and rewarded. For every Minnesotan who wants to buy their first home. For every parent who wants a better world for their kids. I'm running for everyone who wants more affordable health care. For every student, farmer, dreamer, and builder. And I'm running for every Minnesotan who wants ICE and its abusive tactics out of the state we love.
What do you think of the presentation, Arshi, going right for, if you're listening on the radio, she's showing the streets of Minneapolis at this difficult time, going right for the issue that's driving this whole debate?
Well, I actually also think she meets the moment. Mm-hmm. You know, you notice she's used the word every multiple times. So It's not that she's going to represent Republicans or Democrats or, just really focus on one group. She's going to represent everybody in the state. Mm-hmm. And I think that really reflects who she is as a legislator. She is a fighter, but she's also a pragmatist, and she's experienced. So I think there are a lot of good synergies, and we need that kind of spirit in Minnesota to bring people together rather than tearing them apart.
So you like this idea. Minnesota backed Kamala Harris over President Trump by 4 percentage points in the presidential election. Maura, what's this race going to be like?
Well, it's interesting. I don't know that it will make a big impact, but something of note, just as a former congressional staffer myself, she struggled in years past with a poor reputation from staff members who, both on staff side and on the campaign, who accused her of being a bit abusive as a boss and as a leader. So it's going to be interesting because I imagine Republicans are ready to gear that up and to put out some campaign ads highlighting that. I don't know that it will impact voters given the fact of what's going on in Minnesota right now, but I do think that that's going to be a attack ad against her. But like I said, I don't know that it will necessarily sway or derail her campaign in any way. But it'll come to light.
Mm-hmm. Remember the snowy announcement for the presidential campaign? Did this go better? I mean, she could have done it a couple days ago while it was really snowing outside. She didn't go for the optics, I guess, like last time.
No, I think she picked the right moment, and she recognized the gravity of what was going on the ground, right? Mm-hmm. So I think she waited, and I think the timing was appropriate. But I also think that she is going to be able to bridge divides that are so critical at this particular time.
Yeah, well, we'll be following it very closely with the help of our great panel. Arshi, Siddiqui, Bellwether, Maura, Gillespie, Bluestack, thank you so much for your insights and a great conversation today as we look forward to a couple of important interviews that'll take place this afternoon. First, Gavin Newsom, the governor of California, is going to be right here on Bloomberg, 2:15 p.m. Wall Street time. You're not going to want to miss it. And on the late edition of Balance of Power, 5 p.m. Eastern Time, our conversation with the new mayor of New York, Zohran Mamdani. He'll be sitting down with Miles Miller at City Hall, and you'll want to be here for it. 5 p.m. Eastern Time, only on Bloomberg. Coming up in a couple of hours, according to the press secretary at the White House, Caroline Leavitt, just now on Twitter, President Trump to sign an order launching a new initiative to address drug addiction. We'll let you know what that turns out to be. That should be just after the closing bell in the 4 o'clock hour. All ahead of the big premiere tonight. It's the Melania documentary being premiered at the Kennedy Center, and it will be a who's who of the administration, of course, beginning with the president and the first lady. The Hollywood Reporter adding a bunch of names to what is a pretty carefully curated guest list, it looks like. Jordan Belfort will be there. The Wolf of Wall Street, former New York City Mayor Eric Adams, FIFA President Gianni Infantino, Dr. Phil will be there, a collection of former NFL players, UFC fighters, Waka Flocka Flame will also be on the red carpet. The after parties will follow. There's an official party and one that Don Jr. Is putting up. And this film that Amazon paid $40 million for is going to be opening across 1,500 movie theaters beginning tomorrow. Just don't look for Jim Justice on the red carpet. With news today from Notice, his favorite haunt in the area when he goes out for steak is not the prime rib, it's not the Capitol Grill, it's not Joe's Stone Crab, it's the Outback Steakhouse. There's one in Arlington that he likes to go to, and he has a special booth for Baby Dog. This is where they hold staff meetings, according to notice. The president held a cabinet meeting earlier. It went 120 minutes long. Well, I should say an hour and 20 minutes. I'll get the math right here. He never called on Kristi Noem, who was at the table. We did hear from Tom Homan earlier today, though. Remindingly, went to Minneapolis in the wake of the fatal shooting last weekend to try to dial down the temperature. And in his conversations with local authorities, with the Mayor Fry of Minneapolis, with the governor, Tim Walz, he talked about new tactics, a new approach on the ground that would start unwinding some of what we've been seeing, including roving ICE agents. Here's what Tom Homan said in his morning news conference.
So if we get these agreements in place, that means less agents on the street. More agents in the jail means less agents in the street. This is common sense cooperation that allows us to draw down on the number of people we have here. Yes, I said it. Draw down the number of people here. We will conduct targeted enforcement operations. Targeted, strategic enforcement operations.
Two important words there. Draw down and targeted. Great opportunity to spend some time with Brian Gant, the Associate Dean of Technology and Assistant Professor Cybersecurity at Maryville University. He's a former Secret Service special agent and has unique perspective on what we're talking about here, the tactics on the ground. Brian, welcome back to Bloomberg TV and radio. Are these positive moves to start dialing down, drawing down the number of agents who are there, and also taking a different approach when it comes to roving, having actual targeted missions with a warrant and a destination? What do you make of this?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me, Joe. But yeah, I welcome what we just heard about the potential drawdown. The tactics that we've been seeing over the last few weeks or few months, the roving agents, sometimes we will refer to them in law enforcement as jump out squads. Those types of tactics do nothing more than incite and cause confusion and disruption. And when you want to basically divide the two, when you want to have a kind of a arresting unit and you want to kind of have a unit controlling would-be trespassers or those who are trying to interject themselves, you want to have targeted operations so you can keep down the level of confusion.
How important is the training aspects of this, Brian? It's not as tangible as body cameras or no masks or some of the other things that we've heard about here. But some of these agents in the rush to try to gain more presence on the ground were apparently seeing 47 hours of training before they're finding themselves in the line of duty. How important will it be to make changes to the training of these ICE agents?
The training is very, very critical, Joe. Whether it's deportation agents or it's officers, or if it's ICE agents. Half of my Secret Service class was ICE agents at the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center in Georgia. We went through 7 months of training, and we were taught, some of the worst things you can do when trying to effect an arrest is get to the ground, because anything can happen, right? And so whether it's getting to the ground, it's causing disruption, some of those tactics we were taught in that 7 months. You want to stay away from, right? It's all about control. It's all about de-escalation. And what I've been seeing lately is none of that, right? I haven't been seeing the level of control from officers and agents, controlling the scene, right? And sometimes, people don't understand being put in handcuffs is not only for safety of the officers or the agents, but it's for safety for the citizens as well, right? But when you see grappling going on and ground fighting and things of that nature, there's no control. And unfortunately, you see what we had this past weekend, the unfortunate death.
What do you think of the issue of masks, Brian? This has been very controversial, and we've heard Tom Homan and others describe the need for these agents to wear masks so they are not identified in public, so they're not doxxed and their families are threatened. Is there some validity to that argument? Because we're talking about potentially here in this new legislation that's being crafted in Washington having a no mask rule.
Yeah, I can understand from a safety perspective, being an agent for almost 20 years. Sometimes you go into situations where you want to protect your identity because you're concerned about your family and loved ones. But the environment that we're in now, accountability is of the utmost respect, right? And so you want to see the individuals who are carrying out these orders and things of that nature because you want to hold individuals accountable. So, and unfortunately, I think because of some of the rhetoric that we've been seeing, and it's been inciting things that now all of a sudden we have no control over. Right now, the snowball is going too far down the hill. So, whether or not that law gets passed, I'm not sure. I can see both sides, but I understand that, the identity protection in terms of family is concerned.
Wow. So they should be allowed to wear masks, or do we go back to this division of responsibilities and the arresting units are the ones who should have their faces obscured, or do you mean all of them, Brian?
Well, depending on who decides, who makes that decision, it's kind of out of my scope. What I'm saying is I can see both a side of those wanting to protect themselves from a family perspective, but I also can see an accountability side, on the other side as well. So depending upon the operations, and I'm not familiar with the exact operations and what's being pushed down from Homeland Security in terms of those orders. I've heard varying reports on how they choose to divide and conquer in terms of affecting arrest or actually protecting those who are lawfully protesting. So hopefully, whatever the decision is made, hopefully it's a decision that both sides can live with.
Is this specifically about the tactics of ICE or the wider issue of militarizing our law enforcement in America?
I think it's a little bit of both, right? Nobody wants to go down the street and see officers with automatic rifles slinged across and with masks on, right? It already heightens up the level of tension in an already very, very tense situation, right? But there's also a level of protection that needs to be held with those officers as well. Right. You often have times, people come from outside, let's say the Minneapolis area, to particularly incite riots and mask themselves as peaceful protesters. And they're there to pick a fight and then they leave. Right. And that gives those who are there lawfully protesting a bad name. So, you have to find, and what I'm hearing, whether it's the drawdown of troops, officers, ICE agents, and whether there's some cooperation, a little bit more cooperation that's going to be held between maybe state and local law enforcement. That's what you want, right? You want to have that state and local law enforcement because they have more of that community aspect, the community policing aspect, where they can bring down the tension level that's there. But when you have people coming from the outside, those who you don't know, that tension level always rises.
How does this spill over into your former job as a Secret Service special agent? We've talked about a lot in the past year, certainly since Butler, the needs to reform the Secret Service, to better fund the Secret Service, to do its job on one end of Pennsylvania Avenue. Now we're talking about Capitol Police having additional resources with members of Congress to protect, with hostilities against members and their families up 57% over the past year, according to Capitol Police. Do events like the ones we have seen in Minneapolis make it more difficult to secure our elected officials here in Washington?
It does. It's a difficult job in terms of, especially if you have any kind of open air rallies, any kind of parade routes. As Secret Service agents, we are always taught to, if we can have our say, to be in a hardened facility, a covered facility. Those are the things that we want because it provides maximum protection, right? One way in, one way out, ingress, egress routes. But we all know that there's a fine line that you have to toe there. There's a fine line during a campaign when White House staff wants our elected officials to be seen, and they want them to be able to do rope lines and things of that nature. So the job always gets harder, right? And so you just have to do what you can do to provide maximum protection as much as possible. And in these days and times, that's becoming very, very difficult.
Well, that's for sure. The attempted attack against Ilhan Omar that we saw just a couple of days ago. This guy, that was not outdoors. They were actually in a pretty small room for a town hall. He got up and tried to spray something at her that came out of a syringe. She was tackled by security. She appears to be okay. But Brian, it really reminds us of the threats facing all elected officials right now, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. It's kind of a job with a double-edged sword, right? We need our elected officials to make these decisions and move our country forward. But now we're in a environment of where, our elected officials are being threatened, are being killed. And it's very, very unfortunate. So hopefully calmer heads can prevail and we can get back to the business of doing what we need to do to protect the citizens. So that's what it's all about.
Brian, it's good to see you again. Brian Gant, Maryville University, former Secret Service. Thank you for the insights today on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Joe Mathieu in Washington. We're looking ahead to a couple of important interviews that you're going to want to make time for. One of them is only about 20 minutes away with the governor of California, Gavin Newsom, live on Bloomberg TV and radio coming up 2:15 Eastern time. And on the late edition of Balance of Power, when you and I meet back here at 5 p.m. Eastern, a sit-down conversation with the new mayor of New York, Zohran Mamdani, at City Hall with our own Miles Miller in an important conversation that will help to drive our coverage. We'll be spending some time as well with Senators Dick Durbin and Ted Budd after the vote today failed in the U.S. Senate. Both of them, by the way, voted no, the D and the R, setting up a likely partial government shutdown, but also a deal that could emerge in just days when it comes to DHS funding and redialing restrictions on ICE that we were just discussing with Brian Gant. This is going to be a big part of our coverage on the late edition of Balance of Power as we get a sense of what form that deal might take between Democrats and the president. I'm Joe Mathieu. This is Bloomberg.